Chapter 4. Werecon 2012. Stillman and MacDowell Snowbound. Exclusive Werewolf Celebrity Watch Report by Angela Sapworthy. Denver. Following a harrowing auto accident in the midst of the worst snowstorm to hit the city in decades, HOWL leader Kate Stillman and WOOF leader Duncan MacDowell have taken refuge in an unoccupied cabin several miles from the conference site. This reporter talked with a visibly shaken Elizabeth Stillman, Kate's grandmother and the Stillman Pack Alpha. "I'm so relieved they're all right," Elizabeth said. "This is a killer blizzard and I feared the worst. Thank goodness they found a safe haven." Other conference attendees echoed that sentiment, although several wondered whether a storm might take place inside the cabin as well as outside. After a summer of battling online, these two are face-to-face at last with no referee. Emma Wallace, Aidan Wallace's lovely mate and a fellow writer, was heard to say that she would love to be a mouse in the corner of that cabin. This reporter would too. With luck, Kate and Duncan will inform their followers of the details on Sniffer. Duncan had made his case and lost. As he'd unlaced Kate's boots, he'd been struck by this new thought, that the snowstorm had isolated them completely. No one could barge in on them to interrupt whatever might be going on. He had some vivid mental images of what could be going on if they allowed themselves full reign. They'd already vowed to keep their interaction in this cabin private, so they could do whatever they wanted tonight. Maybe that wasn't a noble conclusion to reach, but he wasn't convinced he could be noble for another 12 hours. Given their circumstances, he wasn't sure that she could either, and so why make themselves miserable if in the end they'd succumb? Better to succumb sooner rather than later, in his opinion, and reap the rewards of more time alone together. Once they arrived at the conference, they wouldn't dare step out of line. This would be their one and only chance, maybe literally forever and ever. He'd even begun to convince himself that fate had thrown them together. Tonight, they were unlikely partners, and reason said they wouldn't get along. But on one level, the purely physical, sexual level, they could be a perfect match. Now he would never know. She waved the cell phone she still held. "I'm going to post on Sniffer. Our isolation is making us forget our responsibility, but reconnecting with our followers should help us focus. Until our phones go dead. I don't know about you, but I left my charger in my suitcase and my battery's low." Glancing at her phone, she winced. "Mine too. So here's a thought. Let's each post something on Sniffer and then turn off our phone so we can conserve battery life and post again later." "All right." He retrieved his phone from inside his top coat. "You first." "I'll respond to your sniff." She looked up from her phone. "Just like old times. Except we're not an ocean apart." "Exactly. And therein lies the problem." She returned her attention to her phone and began typing in her sniff. He supposed it was a problem, but he couldn't bring himself to regret a single minute of this adventure so far. Now that he thought back over their sniffs and blog posts, there had always been sexual overtones. Without acknowledging it to himself, he'd expected them to spark off of each other when they met. And they had. Good Lord, had they ever. Done. She pushed a final button. "Your turn." Consulting his screen, he found her sniff. At Kate Stillman. "Duncan MacDowell claims to live in a castle but says he's no prince." "Totally agree." Trying not to laugh, he looked at her, eyebrows lifted. "Well, you did say that." He hid a smile as he typed his response. "Kate Stillman carried a torch for me, but sadly she no longer does." Torch extinguished. She reacted the instant she saw the sniff on her phone. "Hey, no fair." "It's true. But they probably don't realize that you call a flashlight a torch." "I'm responding to that." Her fingers flew over the surface of her phone. A moment later, her reply to his sniff arrived on his phone. "Duncan MacDowell. You're mistaken, woofer. That torch was a flashlight to keep track of your shenanigans." Clear vision. He couldn't help chuckling. Sniffs from woofers and howlers began popping up in response to the interchange, and the battle was on. "Ha! The Italian delegate says my posts are magnifico," Kate said. "That's nothing. The Russian delegate just offered to buy me as much vodka as I can hold." He glanced at her. Guess that woke them up. "Feel better now? More focused?" The silly little banter hadn't helped him one bit. It had only reminded him of the fun he'd had sparring with her this summer. Sort of. She didn't sound very convincing. "Let's turn these things off and save our batteries." Her phone rang before she could do it. Oops. She glanced at the screen. I'd better take this. I won't be long. Powering down his phone, he laid it on the kitchen table as he wondered who the high-priority call could be from. Not her grandmother. If it had been the Stewarts, she would have said so. He suspected a lover. She ran a dating site, so she must have dozens to choose from. Her secretive behavior as she walked into the living room and lowered her voice confirmed his suspicions. And yet, she'd admitted earlier that she'd responded to his kiss because she'd wanted to be seduced. She must not have an exclusive arrangement with this whoever he was. It was none of Duncan's bloody business, but as he went through the cupboards, in search of something they could warm up for dinner, he eavesdropped with morbid fascination. Even with his superior hearing, he only got snatches of the conversation. Yet because his name came up a couple of times, he was reasonably sure Kate was discussing him. Her soft laughter that followed a mention of his name pricked his ego. He acknowledged that he had one, although it wasn't as big as Kate seemed to think. Trading punches on Sniffer was one thing, but he didn't relish being the subject of a private joke between Kate and whatever Randy she was talking to. That was too personal. By the time she got off the phone and came back to the kitchen, his mood had deteriorated considerably. I suppose he's worried about you spending the night alone in this cabin with me. As well he should be, considering that scorcher of a kiss. Duncan took 2 more cans from the cupboard and set them on the counter with a little more force than was necessary. The satisfying clunk of metal cans on the tile counter pleased him. Who is worried? She asked it so innocently, as if she had no idea what he was talking about. But he wasn't born yesterday. The were you were talking to just now. He pulled more cans out of the cupboard without looking at her. It's plain that you have something going with him and he can't be happy about this situation. You're in getting trapped for the night with me. So you think I was talking to my lover? Pretty damned obvious that you were, lass. I'll wager you didn't mention that kiss now, did you? I promised you I'd keep that incident private, and I will. But I suppose you don't know me well enough to trust me not to blab. She sounded so blasted reasonable, so calm. There was even a hint of laughter in her voice. Meanwhile he was seething inside. And for no good reason, either. One kiss didn't mean he had any right to feel jealousy regarding her. He was mostly angry with himself for letting that nasty emotion get its hooks into him. He'd blame his funk on jet lag, and on finishing her book mere hours ago, which gave him an unreasonable view of how well he knew her. Plus their online contact, though contentious, might have tricked him into thinking he was the most important male in her life right now. Stupid. He reached up to the top shelf for more cans. I have to trust you. I don't have a choice. Duncan, you can stop stacking those cans. That's plenty to choose from, and you have some duplicates. He finally noticed that he'd gathered a grocery market full of canned goods on the counter. In his preoccupation with Kate's phone call from her lover, he'd lost track of what he was doing and why. But he hated admitting that. Wanted to make sure we knew all our choices. He waved a hand at the collection he'd created. What do you fancy for dinner? The chili looks good. He glanced at her. That's it? Nothing else then? 1 can of chili is more than enough for me, but if you want some, we should open too. Duncan pretended to study the options carefully, when in fact he'd be happy with warmed up chili too. But he'd hauled all this out of the cupboard, so he picked up 2 or 3 other cans and turned them around to read the ingredients as if trying to decide. Finally he nodded. Chili would be fine. I'll just put this lot back in the cupboard for now. At least you know what's available if you get hungry for something else. He began putting the cans back in the approximate order they'd been before, although he couldn't guarantee they were the way the stewards had them. Other things had occupied his mind while he'd been emptying the shelves. Thanks, Duncan. I'll look for a can opener and a saucepan. There was that hint of laughter again. I appreciate you being so thorough. Still irritated with himself for his behavior, and her for enjoying it too much, he paused and turned to her. I'm glad to be a source of amusement to you, lass. You and your lover too, in fact. I heard you over there having a wee chuckle on my account. That brought her laughter bubbling to the surface. Duncan, that wasn't my lover. That was my assistant, Heidi, reporting that the Fuhrer site is back up and wanting to know if you'd said or done anything suspicious. She's Convinced the woofers are behind our site crashing today. Your assistant. Heat climbed up from the collar of his sweater as he began, replacing the cans faster now. Bloody hell. He felt like a fool, but relieved fool. It was bad of me, I know, but I got a kick out of watching you work yourself into a lather over it while you hauled every blessed item out of that cupboard. She put a pan on the stove. I wouldn't say I was in a lather. You didn't like the idea of me taking a call from my lover right under your nose after we'd both confessed we were attracted to each other. I get that. She opened the first can of chili. If the call had been my lover, I wouldn't have answered. That would have been tacky. Then you have a lover? To his dismay, he discovered that he still hated the idea. Not at the moment. She dumped the can of chili in the saucepan and opened the second one. And now that we're on the subject, do you have a lover? Not at the moment. She emptied the second can, opened a drawer and took out a large spoon. Well, that's good because to be honest, I don't think a hot kiss like the one we shared should happen unless the two words involved are unattached. She turned on the heat under the chili and stirred the contents of the pan. I realize not everyone agrees with that somewhat conservative view, but I do. She glanced up in surprise. Really? I got the impression from discussions online that you like to play the field. Keep your options open. Don't believe everything you see online. When I become involved, it's strictly exclusive. And I expect the same from her. You can't get to know someone unless you agree to see only each other. Her gaze narrowed. You're not just saying that because you read it in my book, are you? No. He propped a hip against the counter and settled into what was becoming a cozy domestic scene. After the long plane ride and the drama of their escape from the storm, he was beginning to relax at last. I was glad to read it in your book, though. So you liked at least that part. She went back to stirring the chili. I liked nearly all of it. The sexual tips are informative. She laughed. They're what made it a bestseller. I did a lot of research for that section. Even though words are taught about sex once they reach puberty, not everyone approaches the subject with imagination. He wondered if the research was personal or academic, but chose not to ask and risk veering off into territory that could get them both in trouble. That's one of the reasons I advocate dating humans. We can enrich our sexual knowledge by tapping into human imagination. But how can humans be of any help when they're limited in their sexual exploration by the threat of pregnancy or disease? They are. And that's why they have to get more imaginative. She looked at him with a challenge in her blue eyes. Okay, name one area in which humans have added to your sexual knowledge. Sex toys. With a wave of her hand, she dismissed his answer. Words don't need sex toys. We may not need them, but why not enjoy them? Why not enhance the experience a little now and then? He shouldn't be talking about such a loaded topic, but sex toys were a perfect example of how words could benefit from interspecies dating and eventually mating too. At least he didn't have any with him, so he wouldn't be tempted to demonstrate. They're just substitutes for the real thing. They're artificial and unnecessary. If he had a couple of items here and the freedom to make love to her, he'd change her mind in no time, but that wasn't the case, so he had to make the argument intellectually. You run a dating site for worse. I can't believe that everyone on your site is successful in finding a partner right away. Maybe not right away, but soon enough, I think. There's nothing wrong with being celibate now and then. She turned off the heat under the chili. It's ready. Do you want to take Edith at her word and open a bottle of their wine? He always enjoyed a bit of wine with his food. Might as well. We'll put it on our tab. She said there's a cabinet in the living room. I'll dish the chili if you'll search out the wine. I'll be right back. He found the wine cabinet with no trouble. Crouching down, he chose a bottle of red from the small supply and located the corkscrew. But as he started to close the cabinet, he wondered if drinking it might soften Kate's resolve concerning him. He should probably keep his mouth shut, because he wouldn't mind a bit if it did. But his conscience prompted him to glance toward the kitchen. Aren't you worried that wine will lower your resistance? I'll take the chance. When dinner is a can of chili, you need something to elevate the quality of the meal, don't you think? I most certainly do. On the way back to the kitchen table, he rotated the dimmer switch. Mood lighting helps too. Definitely. She gestured toward the two steaming bowls on the table. I picked her prettiest stoneware too. Then you might as well see if they have any crystal goblets somewhere. He twisted the corkscrew in and opened the wine. These will have to do, I'm afraid. She set a plain wine glass at each of their places. That'll do. He filled each one to the top and put the open bottle in the middle of the table. Then he pulled back one of the chairs and held it for her. Please be seated, milady. Thank you, kind sir. She took her seat with a smoothness that was very like. Because he'd shared more meals with human females recently, he'd forgotten how fluid a could be in her movements. A few humans he'd dated had come close to that kind of grace but had never quite matched it. This close to her, he became more aware of her scent, one he'd reacted to from the moment he'd walked into the baggage claim area. He'd been telling himself for the past few years that human females had a more exotic scent, and that might be true. But Kate's aroma brought a more primitive response than he'd had to any woman he'd dated. Fighting the urge to lean down and nuzzle the side of her neck, he let go of her chair and walked around the table to his place on the opposite side. Once he was seated, he raised his glass to cooperation. If you mean what I think you mean, I can't drink to that. Stubborn female. But he liked her loyalty and spunk. Then you propose a toast. She lifted her glass to standards. What sort of standards? Werewolf standards, of course. She gazed at him. You are a were, after all. And I assume you have standards, so what's wrong with that? It sounds ominously close to a HOWL pledge, and I don't want to find out later that you've told the sniffer world I took the HOWL pledge. So how about this to greater understanding? She shook her head. That sounds like a WOOF pledge that could turn into a sniffer post about me being in favor of greater understanding between humans and werewolves. No thanks. He looked into her eyes. You really don't trust me, do you? I trust you as much as you trust me, woofer. Then let's drink to the blizzard. The blizzard? Why? Because lass, in spite of all we've been through and in spite of our mutual mistrust and lack of agreement on major issues, I wouldn't have missed being snowbound with you for anything. Her lips curved in a wicked little smile. Same here. She lifted her glass and touched it to his. To the blizzard. He held her gaze as they both drank. He could be wrong, and God knows she was an unpredictable female, but he had the feeling she'd begun to reconsider how they'd spend the rest of the evening. Picking up his spoon, he began eating the chili. Not bad. Anything tastes good when you're really hungry. He allowed that concept to sink in as they both ate some more. Then he picked up his wine glass, took a sip, and broached a subject dear to his heart. Speaking of celibacy, were we? You brought it up a while ago, and here we are eating canned chili and relishing every bite. I'm just making a natural connection between celibacy and hunger. He took another drink of his wine before returning his attention to his chili. I guess you could say they're related. He put down his spoon again and looked across the table. She glanced up. Her eyes were luminous in the soft light of the chandelier. He imagined her in wolf form, blonde and sleek, and discovered to his surprise that he longed to see her that way. He thought the days of where sex were over for him and that he didn't miss the concept. Not true. His body tightened as his mind raced ahead of his words. Would you agree that if you go without sex for a while you enjoy it more when you finally have some? I suppose. So how long has it been, lass? You first. She held his gaze. 6 months. He picked up his glass and took a fortifying swallow of wine. He didn't often reveal that sort of information. Most male wers would think he was crazy to stay out of the game for 6 months. Why? He shrugged. Organizing WOF, writing my book, blogging. And he'd been preoccupied with her since early summer. He could admit it to himself now, although he hadn't realized it before. Your turn. A year. His blood heated. No wonder she'd kissed him so enthusiastically. That's a long time. My excuses are like yours. Organizing HOWL, writing my book, blogging. And then there's Fura Vermeer, which should provide an endless supply of single words for your pleasure. She shook her head. You might think so, but I've been too busy to take advantage of my own dating site. Now that's just wrong. He paused, hoping she was with him on this. You're not busy with those things right now. Surrender glowed in her eyes for a moment, and then she shook her head and smiled. You're good at this, Duncan. Damn it, she'd ruined the mood he'd worked so hard to create. At what? Building an argument, tightening the noose, making others see things your way. No wonder you're the champion of the WOOF movement. He made one last try, although he knew he'd lost the round. This has nothing to do with being a woofer or a howler. I just think. I know exactly what you think. You've made it very clear that despite our differences, we're alike in one way. We're both sexually deprived and would be fools not to take advantage of this golden opportunity to experience what would be an outstanding romp after a long layoff, especially long in my case. Is that such a bad conclusion? I'm not sure yet. She drained her wineglass. I need to consider this from all angles. He groaned. You're torturing me. Maybe so, but according to you, postponing sex makes it sweeter when you finally have it. But that's why we should draw out the suspense even more. I completely agree. The rewards will be even greater, assuming we get together in the end. Kate drained her wineglass. I'm going to grab some of that wood from the back porch so we can build a fire. Duncan pushed back his chair. With the frustration rolling through him, he could probably light it with the tip of his. Chapter 5. Sniffer update at Newshound Cabin score. Kate leads Duncan 2-1 in Zinger. Sniffs. Woofers bet on Duncan. Howlers cheer Kate. Winner takes all. Kate longed to succumb to Duncan's charms more than he would ever know, but no self-respecting female would give in that fast, especially knowing that Duncan was used to easy conquests. She wanted to stand out in his mind, and no matter how this turned out, she wanted that much notoriety. Then she couldn't make a seduction easy for him. She reserved the right not to give in at all. In fact, whether she was strong enough to resist his virile self was another matter. She'd take it one supercharged episode at a time. He insisted on helping her bring in the wood from the back porch. The door leading to the porch opened off the bedroom, and they had to turn on a light in there to keep from stumbling against the furniture. Kate had expected the bedroom decor to be similar to the rest of the cabin, tasteful with a Western motif. She hadn't been prepared for a setup that bordered on sinful decadence. Edith could have at least hinted that the bedroom was a tad erotic. She might have mentioned that the canopy bed was draped in red velvet curtains tied back with gold cords and fancy tassels. Oh, and she could have made a casual reference to the zillion pillows stacked against the headboard in a manner that made Kate want to dive in, scatter the pillows, and roll around on the fluffy gold comforter, preferably with a certain sexy Scottish whir. Full disclosure on Edith's part would have included the crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling that cast rainbows throughout the room, and the thick pile of the fake fur rug at the foot of the bed, which would also make a nice landing area for a coupling couple. Kate was convinced that she didn't know the Stewarts at all. In fact, she'd never look at Bob and Edith quite the same way again. Now there's a bed that belongs in a castle. Duncan paused beside it and leaned under the canopy as if to check out the interior. Then he let out a low whistle. That's certainly a nice feature. What? Kate poked her head in from the opposite side, and her furry hat brushed against the curtains. You mean the rosy glow? Look up. She did, and there they were, both rosy and both reflected in a gilt-edged mirror framed by the top rails of the canopy. Her breath caught. Now she might not be able to face Bob and Edith at all, and they'd always seemed so stodgy. She cleared her throat. I don't know what to say. I've already had my say, and this bonny bed adds an exclamation mark to the end of my statement. Ever watched yourself in a mirror, lass? No, can't say that I have, but I'm assuming you've tried it. Sadly, I have not. She expected him to add that here was another opportunity that might never come again, but he didn't. He probably knew that she was already thinking it, and didn't need to be reminded. His silence on the matter was more potent than if he'd carried on about having sex beneath a mirror. She ducked out again and pulled on her gloves. Let's get the wood. Turning up the collar of her red leather coat, she walked over to the back door and unlocked it. When she opened it, the wind tore it from her grasp. If Duncan hadn't rushed over to block the swinging door, it would have banged into the wall. Gusts of frigid air and swirling snow enveloped Kate and made her wonder what the hell she'd been thinking when she'd suggesting bringing in a load of firewood during a blizzard. She put her hand on the door. Let's lock up and forget the wood. Nay, we'll have a fire. Hold on to the door. I'm letting go. She used both hands this time. Lowering his head, Duncan walked into the teeth of the storm. Put your weight against it to hold it closed, and open it when I call out. She did as she was told because Duncan, bless his lust-warmed heart, was out there gathering wood for the fire she'd requested. She couldn't deny his gallantry, even if she suspected his motives. Soon she heard his command to open the door. She gripped the knob with both hands this time as he came through with his arms full of sweet-smelling cedar, and his topcoat and dark hair dusted with snow once again. She tried not to think of what his wet shoes and socks had felt like when he had to put them back on. He was sacrificing his physical comfort for her, no doubt in the hope it would win him points. It did. Throwing her weight against the door, she shoved it closed and locked it. Well done. Duncan turned and walked back into the living room with his armload of wood. He didn't even glance at the velvet-draped bed. If she didn't know better, she'd think he'd dismissed it from his mind. But she knew better. He was a strategist, and she felt reasonably sure that his goal was to get her into that bed. His current tactic was pretending that he didn't particularly care if he did or not. The bed and the mirror were added temptations she hadn't counted on. Duncan himself was potent enough without adding embellishments like that. Some point she might have to throw up her hands and accept the inevitable outcome. But not yet, by God. She, too, ignored the bed as she started out of the room. But then she allowed curiosity to guide her through a door leading to the bathroom. After seeing the bed, she wasn't surprised at the black jacuzzi or even the European bidet. Black towels, thick and sensuously soft, hung on heated towel racks, although the heat wasn't on at the moment. Kate! Duncan called out to her as he walked back into the bedroom. You'll never guess what I found tucked away on the bookshelf. She turned from the bathroom doorway. X-rated movies? How did you know? It goes with my new image of the Stewarts. She gestured to the bathroom. They're very sensual people. I wouldn't be surprised at much of anything we found now. Nor would I. A smile was in his eyes as he held her gaze. Nor would I. You're thinking they have sex toys stashed in a drawer, aren't you? His smile reached his sculpted mouth. Yes, but we won't be looking for them. Lass, I'm not above having my way with you in that fantasy bed, but I draw the line at borrowing vibrators. Glad to hear it. That was a two-part statement. Which part are you glad about? If it's the first half, then the second half. About not borrowing vibrators. Too bad. He winked at her. If you want to come back into the living room, I've lit your fire. She couldn't help laughing. You're incorrigible. So I've been told. In silent invitation, he swept an arm toward the door. Into the living room. She walked in and discovered that he'd refilled their wine glasses and set them on the coffee table in front of the sofa. She'd halfway expected that he'd have one of the X-rated movies on the flat screen, but it was dark. Maybe he was saving that for later. Thank you for the fire. She took off her coat, gloves and hat. I enjoy pleasing you. She didn't miss the underlying message in that statement, either. After walking into the kitchen and laying her things over a chair, she sat down to unlace her boots. Need some help with that? Thanks. I've got it. She paid attention to the damp laces this time so she didn't knot them again. You've completely abandoned the idea of taking the high road, haven't you? Completely. He sounded unrepentant about it, too. You're free to battle your conscience if you want to, but mine is clear. We didn't choose to be marooned here together in a cozy cabin with a mirrored bed, and the whole setup has a sense of inevitability to it. That's one way to look at it. She pulled off the first boot, and she'd been guilty of having that same view minutes ago. Here's another way. I also see this night as a chance to find a meeting place, a middle ground perhaps between our two warring factions. Now that's delusional. She pulled off the second boot and glanced over at him. He stood with his back to the fire, his hands shoved into the pockets of his slacks and his powerful shoulders caressed by the flickering light of the flames. He reminded her of a Celtic god who had touched down on Earth to bestow his magnificent gifts on a mere mortal. Why is it delusional? His brogue might be the sexiest thing about him, but topped a long list. She took off her socks and draped them over the back of the chair, too. Because there is no middle ground. You're either in favor of worse mating with humans or you're not. He regarded her quietly for a moment. Or to state it another way, you're either moving forward into the future or you're stuck in the past. Or, to state it another way, you're either recklessly endangering your species or you're protecting it from harm and potential extinction. Gee. Stood. Where's your middle ground now, Duncan? Good question. Amazingly, he didn't seem angry at all. It might be located on that king-sized mattress in there. Does it all come down to sex, then? He looked thoughtful for a moment and then he nodded. It might at that. It's a concept to be considered, but I'd rather expand on it and include love. The sexual urge is as old as humans and werewolves, so is the urge to connect on a deeper level that goes beyond physical desire. Wers have always wanted a connection with humans, and humans connect with wers all the time in business, friendship, and sex. They just don't know it. He chuckled. Damn, I should write this blather down. It's somewhat brilliant. She couldn't help laughing. They were poles apart in their philosophy, but he was the most entertaining where she'd encountered in a long time. An unwelcome thought came to her. Would he be half as interesting if they agreed on everything? Surely that couldn't be part of his appeal. When she finally found her soul mate, he would share her beliefs, and that would be one of the many bonds connecting them. Yet in cruising through the profiles on forevermore.com, she'd found dozens of wers who shared her beliefs. She'd told herself that time constraints had prevented her from contacting any of them, but if she'd been motivated to connect with a like-minded wer, she would have found the time. Could it be that if they agreed with her she was bored? She hoped not. Are you coming over to sit by the fire, then? Anticipation glowed in his eyes. She fought the pull of his sexuality. Instinct told her that once she joined him on that sofa, the battle to keep him at arm's length would be over. A warm fire, a glass of wine, soft upholstery, and a hardware, difficult to resist a combination like that. Maybe we should post on Sniffer again first. She turned back to the kitchen table, picked up her phone and hit the power button. Perhaps we should. His tone was indulgent, as if he knew she was only delaying the inevitable. Would you mind bringing my phone over? Sure. As she reached for his phone, she glanced at her screen and grinned. Angela Sapworthy says the cabin score is 2-1 my favor. How did she come to that conclusion? I guess because I posted 2 zingers and you only posted 1. She carried his phone into the living room, rounded the sofa, and handed it to him. He gave her a pained look. I didn't plan on anyone keeping score. You should have. Don't you suppose they're making bets on whether we strangle each other before the night is over? Understanding sharpened his gaze. You're right, lass, and that's exactly what we want them to be doing. Our cover story is pretending that we've been fighting ever since we first laid eyes on each other. But I thought you were all about love and cooperation? She perched on the sofa. I am, but we're not ready for that yet. Your howlers are making that transition difficult, if not downright impossible. Good. That's our mission. She tapped quickly on her phone's keyboard. And the score is now 3-1, so you'd better step up the pace, woofer. Duncan had never met such an infuriating and sexually exciting female in his life. Nothing was simple with her, and that aroused him in ways that he hadn't believed possible. He wanted her surrender, naturally. He was desperate for in fact. Yet by God, the battle was almost as sweet as he imagined her surrender would be. Powering up his phone, he remained standing by the fire as he waited for Sniffer to load. She tapped away on yet another post. 4-1, she announced in a triumphant voice. That note of triumph charged up his libido. It had done so all summer, apparently, and now he was reaping the result of months of online foreplay. Consulting his screen, he read the first of her 2 posts. Duncan MacDowell enjoys looking into mirrors. Ego to big forkabin. She was bloody cheeky. Perversely, that was what he enjoyed about her. She was already posting another sniff as he turned his attention to the next one. Duncan MacDowell expects everyone to sing the same song. His, of course, preferred Chidawheeling. And a third popped up. Addendum to previous sniff. His song out of tune, but what can you expect when he can only woof? Harmonious showler. With a grim smile, Duncan responded. Kate Stillman is laced up way too tight. Tends to get tied in knots. One loose woofer. He didn't stop with one sniff, though. If Angela Sapworthy was keeping score, he needed to win one for the woofers. So he typed out Kate Stillman should see an optometrist. She and the howlers have tunnel vision. Farsighted woofer. Kate was reeling off more sniffs, too. He ignored hers and kept typing. Another post and another and another. His eyes ached from staring at the tiny keys and the small screen. Enough. He looked up. Kate had flopped back onto the sofa and closed her eyes. This is insane. We should quit before we both end up with terminal carpal tunnel. The sight of her lying against the sofa cushions with her arms flung out stirred him more than a little, but he didn't trust her not to be using exhaustion as a tactic. You're just saying that because you want to quit. While you're ahead. She opened her eyes and there was a definite gleam there. Am I ahead? I think that's an excellent guess considering that you're trying to talk me into quitting. Mischief danced in those blue eyes. Okay, I'm one ahead of you. I didn't expect you to catch up so fast or to keep going this long. Aren't you supposed to be jet-lagged? I am jet-lagged, which makes my performance in this contest that much more impressive. Braggart. Sneak. You thought I'd take pity on you because you're too tired to go on. Well, I'm posting one more sniff to tie it up. If you really want to quit, then don't post again. Because if you do, I will. How much battery do you have left? None of your bloody business. But her question made him think her phone was about to die. He glanced at his and realized that his was also in bad shape. What do you say, milady? Will you allow me to tie the game so we can give up this crazy enterprise, drink some wine and enjoy the fire? She pursed her lips. Depends on what you plan to say. How he wanted to toss the phone aside, go over there and kiss that saucy mouth of hers. Tell you what, I'll show it to you before I send it. How's that? All right. He composed what he hoped was his final sniff of the night because he would dearly love to stop doing this and move on to other things like kissing her. Until neither of them could think straight. Kate Stillman is misguided, but she's a worthy opponent. Tired off typing. Let me see it. She held out her hand. Walking over, he settled his phone in her outstretched palm and allowed his hand to brush hers. He felt that slight contact right down to his bare toes. He took note that her toes had curled a little too, and he hoped that was all his fault. She read the post. How about taking out the misguided part and just saying, I'm a worthy opponent? Would you do that? He noticed how sexy she looked sprawled on the sofa, considered the 2 glasses of wine on the coffee table, and made his decision. Go ahead. Fix it. You trust me to do that for you? He shrugged. If you sabotage that post, then I suppose I'll just have to send another one labeling you a dirty player. Yeah, you would too. Damn right I would. Her fingers moved over the keys. Okay, it's sent. And you have almost no battery left. She held out the phone. He took it, once again making sure that he touched her soft skin in the process. When he checked the post that came through, it merely said that she was a worthy opponent. She hadn't tricked him. He glanced up. I'm going to shut this down. I think there's enough battery left to make a quick phone call if we need to. How about you? She smiled at him. Mine's totally dead. She tricked him after all. So I could have one. You would have been literally powerless to stop me if I decided to break the tie. She sat up and reached for her wine. I don't ever consider myself powerless. She gazed at him over the rim of her glass as she sipped from it. His groin tightened. I don't suppose you do. Remind me never to underestimate your power. He busied himself with the fire and decided against adding another log. If the rest of the evening went as he'd hoped, he wanted this particular fire to die down while a different sort was created under the mirrored canopy. When at last he joined her on the sofa, he left a civilized distance between them. Cozying up to her right away would lack finesse. He hadn't used much of that when he'd kissed her earlier, so he intended his present approach to be more subtle. Her surrender would be more complete if she came to him. He wasn't sure if she would or not. For the first time in his life, he lusted after a female who was as smart, probably smarter than he was. He picked up his wine glass. Do you suppose we can come up with a toast we agree on, or should we just drink the damn wine and forget about toasting anything? Oh, I think we need a toast. She lifted her glass. To worthy opponents. You consider me a worthy opponent as well? That pleased him. She looked into his eyes. I do. I confess I enjoy matching wits with you. Glad to hear it, because I enjoy matching wits with you. To worthy opponents. He touched his glass to hers and drank. I suppose that round of sniffs will keep Angela Sapworthy busy for a while. Kate took another swallow of her wine. I'm sure she'll be dissecting every word for hidden meanings and innuendos. But I think we established our mutual antagonism and dedication to our respective causes, don't you? If we didn't, we gave it a good try. He wasn't sure where she was going with her comments, but she might be headed exactly where he wanted her. Anticipation fizzed in his veins. Before my phone died, I checked the time. Gazing into the fire, she raised her glass and took another sip. And bedtime was what he was thinking. And it's morning already in Scotland. She glanced over at him. You've put up a brave front, but I have to believe you're dead on your feet. Think you should go into that bedroom and get some sleep? I agree with some of that statement. I'll take the sofa and… Hold on a minute there, lass. I think you took a wrong turn. You'll not be bedding down on the sofa. If anyone does, it'll be me. That makes no sense. I'm smaller and will fit better. Besides that, I didn't just travel halfway around the world. So I'm to go into the bedroom and get some sleep and leave you here on the sofa to do the same. It wasn't going to happen like that, but he wanted to be clear on her intentions. She nodded. It's the intelligent thing to do, and I know you're smart. Duncan, you'll have a big day tomorrow, and because I consider you a worthy opponent, I want you to be at your best. I don't want you stumbling around because you're tired. I think it would suit your purposes if I'm not up to par. Not really. I don't want attendees to start agreeing with your position, because your dedication in the face of exhaustion turns you into a hero. Want this fight to be even? What if my ability to function is compromised by extreme sexual frustration? She laughed. Nice try, but I'm sure you can subdue your sexual urges in order to be an effective leader in the morning, especially if you get some sleep. Now it was his turn to drink his wine and stare into the fire. He wondered if she played chess. She'd be good at it if she did. She'd neatly maneuvered him into a corner. He could either walk into that bedroom alone and prove that he placed duty ahead of his appetites, or he would have to admit that he didn't give a hang about duty and had no control over his impulses. Although he didn't care for either course of action, he had little choice. He had to agree to sleep in that bed, with its red hangings, fluffy pillows, and overhead mirror without her. Draining his glass, he stood. You'll need pillows and blankets. God knows. That bed has pillows to spare, and an extra blanket or two must be stored somewhere. So you agree to my plan? She stroked the stem of her wine glass. He really wished she wouldn't do that, especially now that they wouldn't be rolling around on that big bed together. I agree with your plan. I don't like it, but you make a valid point about the conference beginning tomorrow. Oh, it to my followers to be. That's all I needed to know. Setting her wineglass on the coffee table, she also stood. You've passed my personal test, Duncan MacDowell. You place duty to your cause ahead of your immediate personal desire, and I admire that. Aye, but admiration is cold comfort when… What do you say we enjoy the best of both worlds? He stared at her with no idea of what was coming next. How? Let's occupy that big bed together. We'll have some fun and then we'll sleep. How does that sound? His heart slammed against his ribs. Good. He was amazed that he had the power of speech. It sounds good. No question about it, she was definitely smarter than he was. But it didn't matter if she was a certified genius. She hadn't had sex in more than a year. And when it came to giving a female pleasure, he'd pit his skills against those of any male, were or human. Very soon the scales would be balanced. She glanced at the fireplace where embers still glowed. We should bank the fire. Aye, I'll do it. And he'd take a moment to rein himself in as well. She'd invited him to share a bed with her, but if he rushed the process, he could still ruin the experience for both of them. You go ahead. I'll tend to the fire and turn off the lights. Her eyes taunted him with the promise of heaven. I'll be waiting. He clenched his fists to keep from grabbing her as she turned and walked into the bedroom. I won't be. Chapter 6. Werecon 2012. Stillman, MacDowell creates Sniffer Blitz. Exclusive Real-World Celebrity Watch Report by Angela Sapworthy. Denver. Werecon 2012 attendees are buzzing about the recent outpouring of sniffs from the smartphones of WOOF leader Duncan MacDowell and HOWL leader Kate Stillman. As reported here earlier, Stillman and MacDowell remain trapped in a cabin during the killer storm that continues to buffet the Denver area. Those sniffs indicate the antagonism between the rivals is at the boiling point. Stillman accused MacDowell of having a gigantic ego. In response, MacDowell sniffed. Kate Stillman is laced too tight. This reporter spoke with Kate's cousin Neil Stillman, who has known Kate all her life. My cousin means well, he said. But MacDowell's right. It's like Kate has a corset around her mind when it comes to progress. She needs to wake up and realize that change is coming, and my great-aunt Elizabeth Stillman agrees with me. I pity MacDowell being stuck in that cabin with her because she can be a handful. I have the childhood scars to prove it. Meanwhile, the howlers rally around their leader and congratulate her on her barrage of sniffs. Even though the sniffer battle ended in a tie, howlers claim victory after MacDowell sent the final sniff, acknowledging that Stillman is a worthy opponent. His grudging respect demonstrates the class we all expect from that hunky were. In related news, sources have revealed that Kate Stillman's popular dating site Forevermore.com was down for several hours today, and hackers are the suspected cause. Howlers have been quick to blame woofers for the apparent sabotage, but woofers deny all knowledge of the incident. This reporter is on the edge of her seat as the battle between howlers and woofers begins in earnest tomorrow morning. Will Kate Stillman and Duncan MacDowell be in attendance? And will they be in one piece? Watch this space. Or follow me on Sniffer at Newshound. Kate held herself together until she was inside the bedroom. Then she hurried on through and into the bathroom. After turning on the light, she closed the door, braced both hands against the tile counter, and gasped for air. She'd wanted Duncan to think she was in control of the situation, but in reality she felt like a rookie driver at her first Indy 500. She was not virginal were by any means, but she'd never encountered the likes of Duncan MacDowell. From that first kiss she'd known how much he wanted her, and yet despite the lure of the fantasy bed, he'd been willing to give up sex for his cause. Until that moment she hadn't been sure how tonight would end, but his sense of honor had seduced her far more effectively than broad shoulders and a dazzling smile. His reluctant sacrifice had tipped the scales. So now she'd said yes to him, and she was shaking like a leaf, both from nerves and lust. So far she'd held her own by playing mental games, but she couldn't forget that his jet-lagged brain must be operating at half power. She'd been lucky to catch him at a disadvantage. She had the distinct feeling that once their clothes were off and they'd climbed into that bed draped with red velvet, her advantage would disappear. His sexual prowess wouldn't be affected by jet lag. He'd fall back on his natural abilities that he'd honed while making love to dozens of females. Both were inhuman. He might assume that she was equally worldly because of all the sexual tips she'd offered in her book, but she'd gathered those tips by interviewing other female werewolves. Only a few of the suggestions came from personal experience. Now was not the time to confess that. But like the rookie at the Indy 500, she was eager for the race to start. Now that she'd decided to go for it, she acknowledged that having this private time with Duncan in a cabin designed for passion was an opportunity that would never come again. If she'd passed it up, which she'd come close to doing, she might have regretted it for the rest of her life. As she opened the door and walked back into the bedroom, she heard him shoveling ash over the remaining embers in the fireplace. She wanted him to be thorough because the last thing they needed to do was cause more damage to the Stewart's love nest. Although she'd automatically flipped on the chandelier when she'd first rushed in, it created far more illumination than she was comfortable giving to this scene. How odd that the Stewarts had installed a dimmer switch in the kitchen, and none in here. She turned off the chandelier, but there was no alternative, no little bedside reading lamps to give a subdued effect. Perhaps the Stewarts didn't read in bed because they had more interesting things to do there. Eventually she settled on using the bathroom light and closed the door so only a sliver peeked through. Better. Next she stripped off her clothes, doing it quickly because she wanted to be in bed and under the covers when Duncan came in. Considering the boldness with which she'd suggested this rendezvous, she should greet him with the chandelier blazing while she lounged naked on the bed. She wished she possessed that kind of daring. It would make him do a double take, and she'd love to see him at a loss for words once again. That moment in the living room when she'd suggested they share the bed had been a real triumph. But she feared that she couldn't pull off a stunt like greeting him wearing nothing but the rainbows given off by the crystal chandelier. And if she couldn't do it without blushing and trembling, then she didn't want to attempt it at all. Besides, even though they turned up the heat, The cabin was still on the cool side. Presenting herself naked in chandelier light would lose its effectiveness if she was also covered in goosebumps. Consequently, the moment her clothes were off, she dived under the covers, scattering pillows and gasping at the icy feel of the sheets against her warm skin. Then she rolled to her back, pulled the covers to her chin and waited, her heartbeat drumming in her ears. Her breathing seemed exceptionally loud, too. She tried taking shallower breaths, but that made her feel dizzy. Lights flicked out in the other room and footsteps approached. She held her breath and then caught herself doing it when she grew lightheaded again. Passing out wouldn't be a good move right now. He appeared in the doorway, his impressive bulk in shadow. Why are you lying here in the dark, lass? Good question. By doing so, she'd revealed herself as a nervous Nellie. After all, I thought the chandelier was a little bright for sleeping. I suppose it is bright for sleeping. He flipped the switch. But when I'm making love, I like to see what I'm doing. Unless, he crossed to the bed and gazed down at her. Unless you're a wee bit shy, perhaps? You've pulled the covers right up to your chin. I was cold, but she wasn't now. His hot gaze had an amazing effect, and now she was sweltering under the weight of the blankets. She felt like throwing them off, but that would give the lie to her excuse, and besides, she wasn't a Tata kind of lover. She was more of the slowly reveal herself kind. Ah. He nodded as if accepting her story. Let's see if I can do something about that. And he began pulling off his clothes. His sweater came first, then the t-shirt under it. His chest lightly furred, with dark hair, expanded as he drew in a deep breath. The more he took off, the higher the temperature climbed under the covers. It's always a little nerve-wracking the first time with someone new. He unfastened his slacks and took those off, leaving him standing by the bed in knit boxers. The material was stretched over an impressive erection. Kate thought she'd go up in flames. She felt damp all over, but she was more than damp between her thighs. As she shifted restlessly, she felt the slippery wetness created by watching Duncan disrobe. Her pulse beat frantically as she waited for him to slide off those knit boxers. He paused, his thumbs in the waistband. I just remembered something out of your book. You suggest taking each other's clothes off and doing it slowly so you each get used to being naked with someone new. It's only, she stopped to clear her throat, only a suggestion. I know, but it seemed like a good one, and without thinking I've gone and stripped off everything except my boxers. Maybe I should wait on those. That's okay. She still sounded like a frog, and she wanted those boxers off. SAP. Did you leave on anything for me to take off? No. And you can take off. But see, you removed your clothes and then covered yourself up again. You might have been cold, but you also might have been hoping to take nakedness in stages like in your book. She could see that he was hung up on her damned book, so finally she found the courage to do what she should have done when he turned on the light. She threw back the covers. His eyes widened. Oh, lass. His tone was reverent. My bonny lass. Please take off your boxers, she murmured. With pleasure. He shoved them down and kicked them away. I like what I see in your eyes, milady. She looked up. And what do you see there? Lust. Anticipation. He settled a knee on the bed. Much as I'm feeling, I'll wager when I look at you. His glance swept her from head to toe and his lips curved. I don't think you're shy anymore. No, she reached for him. Come closer. Let me touch you. 'Tis all I've been wishing for, to touch and be touched. He moved on to the bed and stretched out, his body close enough to feel his heat, but not yet entwined with hers. Well, and perhaps a bit more. But let's begin with that. Let's explore. She smiled. You read that in my book. I did. Resting his head on a pillow, he cupped her face in one large hand. And I confess that when I read that, I imagined exploring your body, Kate. That's quite a confession. Desire sizzled through her as he trailed his fingers along the curve of her throat and caressed her bare shoulder. She followed his lead, brushing her fingertips over the bristles on his jaw. When he smiled, his teeth were very white against the darkness of his beard. Are you disarmed by my honesty? Yes, but I'm also disarmed by other things about you. Do tell. I don't know if that's wise. We both know you have a large ego. She moved her hand slowly down his corded neck and over to his muscled shoulder. You've deflated it quite a bit in the past few hours. He laughed softly as he stroked downward and cradled her breast. while inflating another part of me beyond endurance. You were planning to endure. You. She lost her train of thought as he slowly massaged her breast. She gripped his shoulder and closed her eyes as his caress made her quiver. I thought it started with the book, she murmured. He slid his hand down her ribcage and brushed his knuckles lightly over her tummy. I think it started with your first post on my blog. She opened her eyes and gazed into his. Really? When I called you a pig-headed radical with your head up your ass? He smiled at her. You read that and wanted to get me naked? You're passionate in your beliefs. His caress moved lower, teasing her moist curls with the very tips of his fingers. That's very sexy. I thought you'd be passionate in other ways too. Anticipation made her breathe faster. She knew his destination and she yearned for his touch there. Desperately she tried to keep track of what he was saying. Could be important, but oh, if he would only. She squeezed her eyes shut again. So you came to Denver knowing that you intended to. Nay, don't think that. Those clever fingers danced along her inner thigh, tracing patterns in the moisture there. I didn't admit any of it to myself. Only thought I was learning all I could about the enemy. It's only now that I understand why I was so fascinated by you. That helped. She gazed at him, needing to reassure herself that this wasn't the endgame of some elaborate scheme to seduce the leader of the Howlers. I'm not that kind of Kate. I hope you believe me. His touch became less random. The pat of his middle finger sought out her most sensitive spot. When he made contact, she gasped. You're very persuasive. Passion drew me to you. He began a slow, deliberate massage of that trigger point. And I think it drew you to me. She moaned softly. Duncan. We have that in common, lass. His touch remained slow but relentless as he built her response with a single-mindedness that unraveled all her defenses. Yes. She trembled as her body prepared for the climax he was creating with only the pat of one finger and the music of his brogue. Whatever happens, the passion will still be there. There are no factions here. Just us. Yes. Her breath caught as the first wave hit. Yes. The explosion came, racking her body as if he'd covered every inch of it with his kisses. As he thrust with the same deliberate surety he'd used when touching her with only one finger, a second wave gathered. She rose to meet him stroke for stroke and reached for the glory he seemed so willing to bestow on her. His breathing roughened. Look up, he said, panting. She'd forgotten the mirror. Gazing above their heads, she watched in fascination as the muscles of his back, buttocks, and thighs propelled him forward again and again. They were both covered in rainbows, but he more than her. Seeing him ravish her so thoroughly while she felt each powerful thrust brought her quickly to the brink of total surrender. Arching up against him, she cried out his name as her world shattered into a million pieces of rainbow-colored crystal. Through eyes glazed with pleasure, she watched him rock forward once more before he groaned and his big body shuddered in the grip of his own orgasm. His spasms rippled within her as he filled her with liquid warmth. Gasping for breath, she continued to gaze upward. She made herself concentrate on the image of their bodies locked together while colored light caressed their skin. So beautiful. This moment would never come again, and when she relived it in the years ahead, she wanted to remember every detail. Duncan remembered little after experiencing a climax so outstanding that it nearly left him unconscious with the pleasure of it. When he woke up, he stretched happily as anywhere would who'd had great sex the night before. Then he sat up with a start. He was alone in the bed, light spilling in the doorway from the other room, the smell of coffee brewing, and a slit of gray light showing under the bedroom window blinds told him morning had arrived, but he had no sense of what time it was. There was no clock in the room, which was logical because the Stewarts wouldn't want to worry about the time as they frolicked in their red draped bed. Guilt hit him as he realized that Kate must have gotten up to turn out the light sometime after he'd fallen asleep. He sure as hell hadn't done it. He only hoped she hadn't had to shove his nearly lifeless body off of her in order to climb out of bed. Although he thought the lovemaking had gone well, he wasn't proud of his follow-up performance. A good lover, especially when in human form, needed to stay awake after the event. He should cuddle, murmur sweet nothings, and then get up to turn out the bloody light if necessary. He should not become comatose, and he certainly shouldn't become comatose. while still lying on top of the poor female whose lungs were being crushed by his weight. Duncan was very afraid he might have done exactly that. In addition, he probably snored like a chainsaw. With a groan of remorse, he swung his feet to the floor where he expected to find his clothes lying scattered about. They weren't there. Apparently she'd tidied up after him too. He had some apologies to make. Good morning, sunshine. Kate appeared in the doorway wearing a white bathrobe that was way too big for her. Her hair was piled on top of her head in a fetching way, and with the light behind her, she looked very much like an angel with a halo. She held a mug in both hands, and from the scent of it she was bringing coffee. A rush of warmth in the area of his heart told him she'd begun carving out a place there. He was ridiculously glad to see her. Images came back to him of Kate with the covers pulled up to her chin and a nervous light in her eyes. He smiled as he remembered how her expression had changed as he took off his clothes. And then she flung back the blankets to reveal a blonde goddess even more stunning than he'd expected, and he'd expected quite a bit. But he'd rewarded her by going right to sleep after the sex. Good morning, Kate. Listen, I'm sorry about. I can't imagine what you have to be sorry about. Are you a coffee drinker or a tea drinker? Either, but coffee's my preference. How do you like it? Delivered by a bonny lass in a gigantic white bathrobe. Although her face was in shadow, there was a smile in her voice. Then this is your lucky day. But I meant, do you like it black or with sugar? If you want cream, there's only the powdered stuff, and personally I don't think that's worth the bother. Black will do nicely. Then here you go. She walked over and handed him the warm mug. Perfect. Thanks. He took a sip. Ah, that helps. By the way, do you happen to know where my clothes are? Everything except your slacks is in the dryer. I found a little stackable unit behind some folding doors in the bathroom. I've already run everything through the washer. I slept through all that? You were very tired. Oh, and don't worry. I checked the label on your sweater before I threw it in, but those slacks need to be dry cleaned. And so my slacks are where? They might be slightly uncomfortable without his boxers, but he wanted to put something on. He'd never been a fan of walking around the house naked, hanging up, but you don't want those yet. They'll be scratchy without the boxers. There's another bathrobe in the closet. Let me get it. Crossing the room, she opened a closet door and pulled out a robe identical to hers. They must belong to the Stewarts. I'm sure they do, but no worries. We can wash these after our clothes are dry. I'm planning to do the sheets too. She handed him the robe. Go ahead and put this on. I found instant oatmeal we can eat for breakfast. She started out of the room. Kate, hold on a minute. She turned back to him. Yes. I behaved like a clod last night. You were wonderful, and instead of staying awake to tell you so, I conked out. Did I fall asleep while I was still over, around, and inside me? Yes, you did. He winced. Did I snore? Horrendously. Damn, that's unforgivable. No, it's extremely forgivable. She walked back over and laid her hand on his chest. I lay there looking up at the mirror while you slept and snored. Felt your steady heartbeat, and I was simply glad to be there. He covered her hand with his and pressed it close. But I weigh twice as much as you. At least. So eventually I couldn't breathe and I had to wiggle out from under you. But the feeling of closeness was nice while it lasted. Curling his fingers around her hand, he raised it to his lips. Thank you for putting a romantic gloss on my sorry lack of consideration. Her sweet description reminded him of the joy of loving her, which produced a predictable response in his nether regions. Perhaps I can make it up to you this morning. I wish you could. She sighed. And don't think I haven't thought of it, because I kept hoping you'd wake up sooner so that maybe. I wish you'd woken me. I did shake you once, but you just moaned and rolled over. Damn it. You should have banged a couple of pans together beside my ear. Would have been glad to wake up so I could make love to you again. She shook her head. I couldn't do it. You needed your sleep. That was my whole point last night, so forcing you to wake up so you could have sex with me wouldn't reflect very well on my character, now would it? There's such a thing as being too conscientious. But he respected her values all the same. What time is it anyway? It's nearly 7. The snow has stopped, and the plows will be here before you know it. 7? Really? The conference starts in 2 hours. That's right, and in order to get this place cleaned up we'll have to be late, but maybe not too late. So that's it. He hadn't expected to feel such deep disappointment that their private interlude was over. That's it. She stood on tiptoe and kissed his cheek. And I'll never forget. This time we've had. Now drink your coffee and grab a shower. I found an electric razor and left it on the counter for you. We have to get moving. Slipping her hand from his, she hurried out of the bedroom. Although her tone had been brisk and businesslike, he suspected from her earlier description of how she'd felt last night that she was as sad about leaving the cabin as he was. But neither of them could let the world know their private feelings for each other. He'd be the most help to her if he adopted her brisk manner from here on out. He would bloody well do that even if it killed him. Hurrying through a shave and shower, he put on the robe. The other robe had been huge on Kate and this one was small on him. He wondered if she'd put on the large size in her haste. No matter. He turned on the light and began stripping the bed. She might think, because he lived in a castle and had servants, that he didn't know how he could strip a bed with the best of them. He wasn't sure how good he'd be at making it back up again, but she'd be around to help with that. After he pulled off the sheets, he held them to his nose and inhaled the sweet scent of making love to Kate. He couldn't seem to accept that it would never happen again. Surely there would be some way that they could. Duncan, can I turn on your phone and call the lodge? Sure, go ahead. He dumped the sheets in the bathroom and walked out into the main area of the cabin. She was talking on his phone while she stirred something in a pan, no doubt. The oatmeal. He guessed she'd called her grandmother. Sure, we'll be ready in about an hour if you can spare. Okay, we'll be watching for them. See you soon. She disconnected. She's sending a couple of snowmobiles down to get us. She tried to call my cell earlier, but of course it's dead. Is there enough battery on mine to check sniffer? We might as well get briefed on what's being said so we don't get blindsided when we head into the conference. Good idea. Let's at least try. She tapped on the phone and gazed at the screen. When she glanced up at him, her expression was bleak. I can't blame you for this because you didn't start it, but your woofers have decided to play hardball. Kate, I can't believe they sabotaged your dating site. I know it looks bad, but it's not about the site. They want to know if you used this time while we were trapped together to get all the dirt on my sister. He gazed at her with a sinking sensation in his gut. He'd avoided this topic on his blog, and he'd been criticized for doing so. In his view, no one should have to answer for the actions of family members. I'm sorry, Kate. I've never encouraged that discussion. I know. She faced him, her expression resolute. But maybe we needed this to come up to remind us that the battle could get ugly and we're on different sides. I don't feel that way now. You should, Duncan. It's still true, regardless of what happened between us. He swallowed. It may be true, but it doesn't have to ruin what we've shared. I'll try my best not to let that happen. She handed him the phone. Me too, lass. But as he read the posts, he wondered if they could possibly hold on to the fragile connection they'd forged in that mirrored bed. Chapter 7. Sniffer update at Newshound. What's the story on Penelope Stillman, Kate's older sister? Kate's not talking. Skeleton in Theclaset. Kate and Duncan didn't bring up the subject of Penny again, but it hung between them as they ate a quick breakfast, finished up the laundry, and put the cabin and themselves into some semblance of order. The snowmobiles arrived to carry Kate and Duncan separately to the resort. The staff members driving them agreed to come back for Duncan's suitcase and arranged to have Kate's SUV towed out of the snow bank. Kate used a staffer's phone to call a reputable window company, and the Stillwell name got her an appointment for that afternoon. She wasn't sure if she'd be able to get away from the conference, but the spare key was in her purse if she had to delegate that job. As the two snowmobiles skimmed over the unblemished surface created by the blizzard, the clouds moved off to display a sky so blue it hurt Kate's eyes to look at it. She thought of all the times she and her sister had ridden like this after a storm. Penny, being 10 years older, had always been the driver, while Kate was the passenger hanging on for dear life. She hadn't minded at all. She'd felt privileged that her big sister, glamorous and daring in all things, had wanted her along. Everyone knew that Grandma Elizabeth was grooming Penny to be the next Stillman Pack Alpha. Their father Woodruff, sweet though he was, didn't suit, so Grandma Elizabeth was looking to the next generation for a were to inherit her position. Penny, magnificent Penny, had been the obvious choice. And then when Kate was 17, Penny had fallen in love with a human. She'd given up everything for him, her family, her position as leader in training, and any hope of inheriting the Stillman millions. But saddest of all, she'd given up her close tie with Kate, the sister who'd idolized her from childhood. At first Kate had grieved along with the other members of her family and her pack, but eventually she dried her tears and had dedicated her life to preventing such tragedies from happening in the future. She'd created her website, forevermore.com, designed to promote the value of werewolf matchups. She'd founded Honoring Our Werewolf Legacy, and she'd written her book. Because Penny had dropped out of the werewolf community entirely, some werewolves didn't even remember that she existed. She and her human mate Tom Rivers had adopted 2 human children. Penny had claimed that she had a blood disorder, and Tom had apparently accepted that as reason enough to adopt. But Penny was only making sure that she had no biological offspring who might turn out to be were. As far as the pack was concerned, Penny might as well be dead. Except she wasn't, and somebody in the woofer movement had decided to make an issue of the fact that Kate Stillman, founder of HOWL, had a sister who'd mated with a human. Kate had dreaded the possibility that someday Penny's name would be mentioned in connection with the Howler movement, but until now it hadn't been. She'd gathered from Duncan's reaction that he'd known about Penny maybe for some time. That only increased her respect for him. He'd known and hadn't used the information to try and tarnish her cause, but he couldn't control his followers, and someone had decided the time was right to drag Penny and her choice back into the spotlight in an attempt to embarrass Kate. Well, let them. Much as she loved Penny, she considered her an object lesson of how human mating generated pain and dysfunction. Penny's mate and her adopted children had no idea that they were living with a werewolf. Kate couldn't imagine how a true bond could develop in the face of such a significant deception. The snowmobiles rounded a curve in the road, and Stillman Lodge, the main structure of the resort, loomed straight ahead. As always, Kate's heart swelled with pride at her first glimpse of the majestic old building that had stood in this spot for more than 100 years. Built of native stone and weathered cedar, it lifted 3 stories into the blue sky. Its solid, enduring bulk was a source of security for Kate, and she imagined it served that purpose for the entire pack. It provided economic security as well, for the staff consisted entirely of pack members. In days past, the lodge had been open to humans and werewolves alike, and Grandma Elizabeth owned a guest book with Teddy Roosevelt's signature on one yellowed page. Teddy had not known, of course, that his hosts had been werewolves. Now, however, the lodge's facilities had been expanded when the property was converted into a were-only resort, one of only 2 in the world. The other, on a small island off the coast of Washington state, was owned by Duncan's brother Colin. A were-only resort could stand in plain sight if it built a reputation for exclusivity. Humans trying to reserve a room at Stillman Lodge were always told that the resort was booked for months, even years in advance. Kate herself had helped spread the rumor that certain celebrities chose to stay at Stillman Lodge and had requested complete privacy for themselves and their entourage. This weekend the resort would indeed be hosting celebrities, but of the werewolf variety. Kate had been secretly dazzled by the guest list, which included pack leaders and representatives from around the world. She'd planned to be on hand to greet them all last night, but instead she'd been with Duncan. She didn't regret that particular detour for a second. She'd requested that her driver take her around and back so she could use a rear entrance and scurry up to her room. She didn't look too rumpled thanks to her laundry project at the cabin, but she wore no makeup and didn't feel particularly pulled together. Her hope dimmed as she noticed who was standing on the wide walkway leading up to the main entrance. A camera crew filmed Angela Sapworthy interviewing Kate's cousin Neil. Angela's sniffer tag fit her perfectly. She was a newshound who smelled a story a mile away. This time, however, she had help from Neil, who'd also inherited the Stillman blonde hair and blue eyes. He spotted the snowmobiles and interrupted the interview to come hurrying down the circular drive toward Kate and Duncan. Kate's driver was forced to stop to avoid running smack into Neil. Kate wouldn't have minded so much his thinly disguised political ambitions. included nudging her out of her spot as Elizabeth's successor so he could have the job. His woofer leanings didn't help her like him either, but she had the feeling he'd take whatever side he found politically advantageous. Kate, thank God. We were all so worried about you. Thanks, Neil. She managed not to roll her eyes. But we're fine. What a blessing. Now that he'd expressed his concern, he walked right past her and held out his hand to Duncan, who'd climbed off the second snowmobile. Duncan MacDowell. It's an honor, sir. Thanks. Duncan shook Neil's hand. And you are? Oh, sorry. Neil Stillman. Thought you'd recognize me from my profile on the Woofer site. I'm Kate's cousin and Elizabeth Stillman's able assistant. Kate swallowed her words of protest. Neil wasn't Grandma Elizabeth's assistant, or at least he hadn't been when she'd left yesterday for the airport. Neil continued to pump Duncan's hand. Welcome to Stillman Lodge. I've read Down with Dogma twice. Brilliant. We're so happy you could make it and that you survived a night with my cousin Kate. He chuckled as if sharing an inside joke. There's a bunch of woofers inside waiting to congratulate you on that feat. Much as Kate wanted to interrupt Neil's ridiculous monologue, she decided that it could serve as a distraction so she could escape and go in the back way as planned. Ryan. She addressed her snowmobile's driver in a low voice. Take me to the back entrance as we discussed. You got it, Kate. He started off again. They managed to get partway around the circular drive before Angela Sapworthy blocked their retreat. She'd marshaled her camera crew as well. Kate, may I have a quick word? Angela usually dressed to startle. Today, she'd paired tight silver pants with turquoise boots and a turquoise quilted jacket. Her hair, an improbable shade of red that veered toward magenta, had been waxed and sprayed into a punk style that made Kate think of a scarlet porcupine, reminding herself that Angela's tabloid journalism had become all the rage. With words, Kate squelched the urge to refuse an interview. Even her refusal would become a story or a sniff, so she might as well try to take control of the news about her, or about her sister. As she climbed down from the snowmobile, she mentally prepared herself for a question concerning Penny. Angela motioned to the cameraman and spoke into her handheld mic. I'm talking now with none other than Kate Stillman, who has just this minute returned from her harrowing adventure. How was your night with Duncan MacDowell, King of the Woofers? Kate frowned. King of the Woofers? When did that happen? I see you're a few sniffs behind, Kate. When you said he was no prince, his followers crowned him King of the Woofers. Your followers, of course, crowned you Queen of the Howlers. So tell me, does he snore? Angela's glistening red mouth turned up in a carefully orchestrated smile. Kate remembered that she had zero makeup on. Oh well. I thought I was in the middle of a chainsaw massacre film festival, Angela. My ears still hurt. She returned the reporter's smug smile. Angela shuddered prettily. Dreadful. But then I'm not surprised. Duncan is such a beast. She gave the word plenty of sexual innuendo. All that testosterone. Sharing a cabin with him must have been an exhausting experience. You have no idea, Angela. As you can imagine, I'm eager to get back to my suite and freshen up. Of course you are. Such an ordeal. Still, I'm sure he's magnificent when he's angry. And you do know how to taunt the beast, Kate. He's easier to manage when he's jet-lagged. Now if you'll excuse me, I really should. One more thing. Have you heard from your sister Penelope recently? Kate kept her expression and tone of voice carefully neutral. Yes, of course. We communicate on a regular basis. Regular meaning 2 or 3 times a year. But she hadn't lied. Penny had sent her a short email last week wishing her good luck with the conference. That was Penny, always classy. Kate was campaigning against the choice Penny had made, and yet she didn't seem to hold it against her little sister. A familiar ache gripped Kate's heart at the memory of that brief email. Woofers have been asking, as I'm sure you would expect, how you can insist that human mating is so terrible when your sister has chosen that route. Penelope and I hold different views on the subject. That doesn't mean I love her any less. Now I really must go. The conference has already begun, and I'm expected to be there. There's a rumor that Penelope will make an appearance this weekend to support the woofer cause. Kate's pulse quickened. Surely not. Penny had dropped out of pack activities completely and distanced herself from her immediate family. God knows what she'd told her husband Tom, But he also must have accepted the estrangement in addition to the made-up story about a blood disorder. The poor guy might even think the rift was his fault because he didn't measure. In a way he was right, but it wasn't anything he could fix. Their mother and father would have loved to spend time with Penny, her husband and her children, as would Kate. But Penny had decided it was safer to minimize all contact. But Angela was waiting, a gleam of triumph in her heavily made-up eyes, for Kate to respond. Kate gave the only answer that might end this line of questioning. I hadn't heard that, but if she comes I would be happy to see her. She hopped on the snowmobile. Great talking to you, Angela. Ryan responded to that cue and sped off, sending a rooster tail of snow into the air. Kate wondered if some of that snow had landed on Angela, and if the cameraman caught it. She hoped so. Duncan watched as Kate got caught in Angela Sapworthy's web. At least he assumed that was Angela with the red spiky hair and tight silver pants. He'd never met her in person, but the presence of a camera crew and Kate's obvious reluctance as she climbed down from the snowmobile told him he was right. He hated seeing Kate waylaid like that, but he couldn't very well go to her rescue. He had his hands full with Neil Stillman, who seemed determined to be his new BFF. Climbing off the snowmobile, Duncan thanked the driver and started up the snowy walkway to the main entrance, accompanied, inevitably, by Neil. Everyone's referring to you as King of the Woofers now, Neil said. Everyone. As a Scotsman, Duncan had a built-in prejudice against the term king, which conjured images of British royalty. Centuries had passed, but a true Scotsman never forgot. Well, the Woofers, I meant to say. They came up with it after Kate sent the sniff saying you were no prince. So you've been upgraded. That's just silly. A feminine cry of dismay made him turn around. Angela had caused Kate to cry out like that. He might have to interfere after all. But no, Angela was the one who was upset and covered in snow to boot. The snowmobile carrying Kate zipped around the corner of the building, but Duncan had no trouble figuring out what had happened. He chuckled. That was a bad move on Kate's part, Neil said. You don't want to make an enemy of Angela Sapworthy. I'm sure it was an accident. Come on, MacDowell. You just spent more than 12 hours with Kate, so you know what she's like. Think about that for a minute and then tell me her little stunt was an accident. She wasn't driving the snowmobile. How could she have engineered that maneuver on purpose? Neil studied him. Surely you're not defending the Queen of the Howlers. Of course I'm not, but what did you call her? Once the Howlers found out about your title, they had to give her one. I'm sure she'll love it. Duncan shook his head. It's childish. I'm going to put a stop to it. Good luck with that. It's all over Sniffer, and once something catches on, you can't do much about it. Those titles have taken on a life of their own. I've already seen pictures of each of you with a crown photoshopped on your head. Ridiculous. Duncan sighed. Well, I suppose I'd better get in there. He started up the walkway again. Duncan MacDowell. His shoulders hunched. Apparently even being covered in snow didn't deter Angela from her appointed rounds. Take my advice, Neil said. Give her a quick interview. She's already leaning toward the woofer side, and after Kate blasted her with a rooster tail, just now you'll have her eating out of your hand. There's an unappealing image. Neil laughed. Sorry. Duncan, may I have a quick word? He turned and did his best to keep a straight face. Angela looked as if she'd been dipped in vanilla frosting. Snow clung to her spiky hair, clustered on her dangly earrings, rested in drifts on the shoulders of her turquoise jacket, and splattered like well-aimed snowballs all over her silver pants. But to her credit, she retained her poise. I couldn't let you go inside without one quick interview. She turned to her cameraman and raised her mic. As you can see, I met with a small accident following my interview with Kate Stillman. She'll be getting the cleaning bill. Angela's laughter had a slight edge to it. I'm talking now with her counterpart in this battle, Duncan MacDowell, and I'm sorry to tell you he did not arrive in a kilt as I'd hoped. Did you bring your kilt, Duncan? I did, but I won't be wearing it until our formal dinner at the end of the conference. Wonderful. I'm sure all the females will be waiting for the moment when they can admire the King of the Woofers in full regalia. Just let me say, Angela, that I'm not comfortable being called a king of anything. And he's extremely humble, folks. Is there a sexier combination than a great Looking where with humility? I think not. Seriously, I would like to ask the woofers to forego giving me that title. Too late, Duncan. They've already held the coronation. They were positively jubilant at the way you came out fighting during last night's sniffer exchange. They're also boasting of your gallantry in your last sniff. Complimenting her on being a worthy opponent made her look ungracious by comparison. At least that's how this reporter sees it. Angela's eyes glittered with malice. Duncan groaned inwardly. Poor Kate. Her attempt to even the sniffer score last night had worked against her. Or if not, Angela Sapworthy would make sure that it did. He began to understand the part Angela would play this weekend, and it wasn't small. He was in a no-win situation. If he told Angela that he'd wanted to send a more antagonistic post and Kate had talked him into a more civil one, then he'd either arouse suspicion about their relationship or get more points for gallantry. His best bet was to get away from Angela as soon as possible. I really should get inside, he said. I hope they haven't gone ahead with the council elections. Of course not. They wouldn't consider having elections without you. Get on in there and claim your place, Duncan MacDowell. If he hadn't been so irritated with her, he would have laughed. She'd managed to dismiss him rather than the other way around. Then I'll bid you goodbye. He turned and started up the walkway once again. And there he goes, folks. King of the woofers. Damn it, he muttered, ducking his head. Get used to it, Neil said as he opened one of two large and intricately carved entrance doors. Your subjects await you. Duncan walked into the lobby and was immediately surrounded by a crowd of boisterous wers, both males and females, wearing woofer buttons and waving woofer signs. Overwhelmed by the barrage, Duncan didn't read any of the buttons or signs, but he heard the words of welcome. The language was English, the official choice for the conference, but the accents were from all over the world. As he fought to get his bearings, a female emerged from the crowd bearing a gold crown on a purple velvet pillow. A chant arose from the group. King of the woofers. King of the woofers. Duncan tried to protest, but he was shouted down. The female were looked so happy to be presenting him with this crown, which someone must have obtained with a great deal of trouble on such short notice. He couldn't figure out a way to refuse it without crushing her and ruining the mood of the enthusiastic crowd. And he wanted them all to be enthusiastic. They believed in the cause he held dear, and this weekend he hoped to convince the delegates to adopt a resolution to end the secrecy. Wearing a crown for a few minutes might be the price he had to pay. Kneeling down, he allowed her to place the crown on his head amid cheers from the group that surrounded him. When he stood again, some instinct made him glance across the lobby. Kate stood there watching the spectacle. She changed into a purple long-sleeve t-shirt with the logo on the front. No doubt the Howler logo. She was too far away for him to gauge her expression, but he could only imagine how she'd react to the idea of him wearing a crown. He wondered if she'd been offered one yet, and what she would do if she was. Her gaze locked with his for a brief moment before she turned away, almost as if signaling that she'd seen enough. He had trouble believing that only hours ago he'd held her naked in his arms, while he listened to her cries of pleasure. Seemed impossible, and the gulf between them widened with every passing moment. He despaired of ever bridging it again.